Friends, thank you for having me. This is a special privilege and opportunity to just reflect back with you. Most of you have been a member of this church throughout my short tenure, and some of you have joined since then. And Elaine just said, I'm interested to hear about the first 6 years of your ministry. I think that any attempt to look back on my tenure here necessarily causes us to look back on 149 years. Think about that, 149 years of worship and of care, of learning, of fellowship, of leadership in this community. So you can't look at 10 years, you can't just sort of excise 10 years from that history. 30 pastors, associate pastors, interim pastors. Think about all of the directors of music. Think about people like Frida and the other youth ministers and children's ministers. You just can't separate that. So that's the first thing that I am so aware of is, oh, and I forgot, literally the hundreds of elders, deacons, and other church leaders that have served over 149 years. We all, and I am particularly aware that I stand on broad shoulders. And I'll like put my shoulder up there too for the next person. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Folks in my business, in my world of pastors, have become fond of saying that all ministry is transitional ministry. That has at least 2 meanings. One of the meanings is that the culture, the world, is changing so fast that we in the church are always in transition. That the gospel never changes. That God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, but the world around us changes. And so that ministry is always transitional. And boy, having done this for the last 40 years, you all know how fast things have changed over these last 4 decades. It's really true. The other way that all ministry is transitional ministry is that always pastors that come eventually go, right? Now, sometimes that's a good thing. You might think, oh, I'm just going to wait this pastor out. I was here before he came, and I'm going to be here after he leaves. But sometimes that's sad. And I've told many of you, for me, retirement is really a sweet thing to think about, but it's also bitter because I know what I'm losing. So, having said that, I want to look back and just kind of lift up before you several, for lack of a better word, accomplishments that together we have made over the past 10 years. So I want to begin with one that is incredibly mundane. And that is when I arrived, you guys had terrible coffee. It was just unbelievable. You have this gorgeous church, and you got this coffee that's in these big round vats that by the time you got to church the coffee had been cooking for 2 hours. And it just was horrible. And what I couldn't believe is that one day I was in the kitchen and I looked over there and you have a wonderful coffee machine. You had it, you just weren't using it. And so all of the leadership books that I have ever read have said, when you come into a new situation and you are a leader, you need to have some tangible successes quickly. And my first success was to get better coffee on Sunday morning. Now, the first real accomplishment we can celebrate together relates back to that 3-year period between when Wallace retired and in October of 2011 when I arrived. Many, if not most of you were here, so you know what I'm talking about. Suffice it to say, our church was struggling. During the transition, there had been power struggles and conflict. Relationships among members had become strained and sometimes broken. Folks were just tired of division and disagreement, and there was a lot of anxiety in this place over the future of our church. And though it took a couple of years, together, we were able to get it back on course. To restore and to build trust in our staff and our leaders. To begin to heal from some of the hurts of the past. And I began to see after 2 or 3 years, we weren't talking about that as much as we were talking about what was in front of us, the future. But it took that long. I think that says a lot about this congregation. That as painful as that period of time was, you guys learned a lot. You learned what can happen and how quickly. You learned a lot about how to handle disagreement and division if it ever happens in the future. And maybe most important, you learned how much you value one another and what you have in this church. So that's the first accomplishment. The second accomplishment was also not without struggle and grief and bumps in the road. I'm speaking of the process of creating the Kairos worship service about 8 years ago. To return to the interim time for a moment, part of what was going on during that time was a growing desire among some of our members for this church to offer a different style of worship. As we know, people are passionate about their style of worship. And as we know, human beings aren't real fond of change. And one thing the Pastoral Nominating Committee was very clear about is they wanted me to help this congregation navigate the treacherous waters of what have been called the worship wars. Well, once the session decided that we would create another worship service, it took a little while to figure out what that would look like, what type of more contemporary service would be a good fit for this church. And then there was the difficult work of deciding how to fit that service into an already existing Sunday morning schedule. That discussion continues, by the way. And finally, and this is maybe what will touch most of you. Finally, there was grief over what some felt as we were dividing one church into two churches. I know it was particularly hard for those of you who prefer a more traditional style of worship in the sanctuary, because what you saw is pews empty out, with young people and children and young families coming to the Kairos service. And I know, because I felt it, you felt left out, you felt left behind. And that wasn't easy. I felt it too. Yet the one thing this whole process showed me about you is that though you don't much like change and would prefer not to change if given the chance, still you can change if you're offered a reasonable explanation about why change is needed and how that change will benefit the whole body of the church. And I really appreciate that about you. Our third accomplishment together was a successful capital campaign that led to a construction project that essentially tied together our 4 separate buildings. Those 4 buildings, as you know, were constructed at different times in our history and for different purposes. And as we know, sometimes that creates problems for full access. So we added parking spaces, we created a porte cochere. Chris loves it when I say that word. We added a front door to the church. We found a way to have a gathering space that this church had never had. We built a very beautiful and functional cloister walk between the sanctuary and this building. We completely renovated our fantastic preschool, and we built state-of-the-art playgrounds for our little ones. And whether you agree with every part of this project or not, whether you now like every part of this project or not, I think we can all be proud that our building is now incredibly functional and accessible as well as beautiful. So our 4th accomplishment together has to do with the financing of the ministry and mission of this church. This too was a concern of the Pastoral Nominating Committee 11, 12 years ago, because at that time, as many of you know, this church was blessed with a handful of very generous members who were covering north of 20% of the annual budget. Although that was awesome, it was not sustainable over the long term. So over the past 10 years, we have talked a lot about the passing of the torch when it comes to both session and committee leadership and when it comes to financial leadership. That passing of the torch continues, of course, because you are passing the torch to others. And your stewardship committee and your next pastor will need to remind you of this often. But the combination of very careful fiscal management and the generosity of the members of this church means that this is a very strong congregation, financially speaking. I thank you for that, and so will your next pastor. Our 5th and 6th accomplishments bring us to the more recent past. The 5th is how together We managed, struggled with, survived, and even thrived during a global pandemic. If you would have asked me what changes I would face during my last 2 years of ministry, not in my wildest dreams would I have thought COVID-19, Alpha, Delta, Omicron BA2. It just kept coming. Not in my wildest dreams would I have predicted the challenges we would face, the decisions we would have to make, the new skills we'd have to learn quickly, and the new ways that we together would discover things that we had never thought of before, that we would discover in how to be the Church of Jesus Christ. We couldn't gather together for worship, but Heather and I can now say we've been TV preachers. We couldn't gather for Wednesday night supper, but we can say we had the tastiest takeout meal in town. We can also say that the pandemic revealed that God has blessed us with a staff that is second to none, with church leaders that are dedicated and wise, and a congregation that is full of members that supported and appreciated its staff, made possible the ongoing mission and ministry of this church through a very unprecedented time. Who would have thought? Finally, our sixth accomplishment is the somewhat new way that we are doing this whole pastoral transition. Back in December of 2020, 18 months ago, I told our personnel committee that I was getting serious about retiring. And after they said, well, it's about time, I suggested that they, the session, and eventually the congregation consider implementing a succession plan that would allow Heather and me to continue to lead the congregation while at the same time you searched for your next senior pastor. You would do the same transitional work that you would have done during an interim time. You would just do it while I was still here, with the hope of not having a long, drawn-out interim period. Now, I suggested this, not lightly, but based on my assumption that FPC is a strong church, a healthy church, a church that is not perfect, but isn't broken, and does not need serious fixing. Well, in part because of the last experience of transition. The personnel committee, the session, the congregation was very supportive. And with the Presbytery's Committee on Ministry's blessing, we have been working our succession plan for the last year and a half, and so far it has gone exceptionally well. The Mission Study Task Force did excellent work, and now the Pastoral Nominating Committee is doing the same. And it's my prayer that before too awful long, you will be greeting your new senior pastor with the same love and enthusiasm in which you greeted me 10 years ago. So thank you. Now, one more thing. I'm keenly aware that what I've just shared is just one way to look at and evaluate the past 10 years. And it may not even be the best way to do that. Because the truth is, I have not even mentioned the more than 500 Sundays that we have worshiped together. That's assuming you had perfect attendance. The many ways that we have all grown spiritually through Bible studies, through Sunday school classes, the countless Wednesday night suppers that we spent enjoying good food and fellowship, the special times visiting you in your homes and your hospital rooms, the many, many times, far too many times, that we've gathered in our sanctuary to celebrate the resurrection and to give God thanks for the life of those who have gone before us. Times we've worked on habitat houses together, or retreated to Montreat, or for some of us walked along the Sea of Galilee, worked in session and committee meetings. Some might say that these are the real accomplishments that we should lift up. And I think they wouldn't be wrong. So today I lift them all up with thanks to God and gratitude to you. Thank you. Anybody else want to say something? You've listened to me long enough.
I have a question.
Sure. Don't sit down, Will.
Aside from the Iowa weather, what made you want to come to Hickory?
To be brutally honest, John, it was to save my marriage.
Well, the weather is brilliant.
I mean, you've heard of happy wife, happy life. I can tell you what, unhappy wife, unhappy life is like. No, that was a lot of it. The call to Iowa, though I grew a lot, Chris grew a lot, and our marriage grew tremendously. It was not a good, I blew it when I thought that that's what God was telling us to do. And so, so both of us felt incredibly blessed at, the ripe old age of, I was in my mid-50s, and there is such a thing as ageism in the church. And so I felt really blessed to be able to get back to the South, and to be in this place. This has been a fantastic fit. But there was a push, and Chris was the push, and there was the pull of this congregation in Hickory. Yeah.
When you warned ahead of time by the pastoral and nominating committee that this church was having problems and was growing at the time, you knew all that.
Oh, they were very clear.
I was going to ask you if you knew what you were walking into.
Yeah, I did. They were incredibly transparent about that. Yeah.
You sure changed all of us.
No, we did that together. But I certainly knew. But I've learned about myself. I kind of like to fix things. I kind of like to help fix things, and I'm not very good at that with plumbing, but I've had some success in churches.
Whit, I think your next stop needs to be Congress.
Yeah, he was.
Well, it's getting deep in here.
No, it needs fixing.
It needs fixing, yeah. Any other questions?
I have to give Chris a lot of credit.
No, absolutely.
Some of us here have had corporate moves, having to reside even in foreign countries.
Right.
And it's not all that pleasant. But I don't think I could ever convince my husband to do what Chris convinced me. But that's in the past.
She's very
That's in the
persuasive.
past.
Just curious, how many churches did you pastor?
So I went to seminary, not to become a pastor, but kind of what I told the reporter for the paper, really just to kind of work things out in my mind theologically. I never thought about being a pastor. I thought I was going to be a teacher or a coach or my vocational training, my vocational testing said I should have been a dentist. I like to fix things, even teeth, I guess. But after seminary, I pastored 2 little rural churches in southern Indiana, right across the river from Louisville. And then I was called to be an associate pastor in a larger urban congregation in Louisville, and I did Christian ed work and youth ministry. I was kind of like Heather was way back. Then I was called to a suburban church in Louisville that had just gone through a severe traumatic interim. They lost, there were maybe 100 active members at the time when I got there. There had been 600 before. But I stayed there 17 years, and it was back up to over 600 when somehow I heard Iowa calling, and I'm not ashamed to confess that I got it wrong, I think, and God fixes those things for us, but I really loved a lot about that. That was a university church, so you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a PhD. But the hard thing about that is they all think they know everything about everything. And they do, yeah, right, John, Dr. Bates. You preach a sermon on the Good Shepherd, and the next morning you've got a 30-page academic paper on sheep waiting on your desk. So we were there almost 5 years, and then came here.
One last simple thing, if it's just a simple question. Your doctorate, wasn't it in youth ministry, more or less?
It was preaching. Exactly. My doctor of ministry was in preaching. Yeah.
But then I thought I read it was leaning towards youth.
It was. When I started my DMin program, I was interested in how to preach effectively to college students, because that's where we were. Yeah.
How do you feel about that as you're retiring? I mean, as what's going on through the whole, everybody knows that churches are dying, and you told me at one time that mega churches and the non-denominational churches are starting to die.
They're starting to decline too. Yeah.
That was gonna be my question, if you would speculate on what the horizon looks like for the Presbyterian Church. We had the PCA, split off in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
And now there's another split with, I can't remember what that branch is called, but they have it in Lenore and Weston.
Right.
What does it look like for our Presbyterian, the real Presbyterian?
Right.
The real
You're exactly right, Judy. You've got the history. You spoke that well. I don't see any other divisions on the horizon. I think the last division was the last division. So that the PCUSA now, at least this presbytery, and this was one of the most divisive presbyteries in the country because Parker Williamson was here, the Presbyterian, the publisher of the Presbyterian Layman. He was the pastor of the church in Lenore, and very divisive person, very divisive, and he got very divisive people to follow him. And but our presbytery now, and Melvin can speak to this, and John as well, it is pretty much of one mind. The people who were going to leave have left, right? Now, what the future holds is that in the next 20 years, 30 years, a whole bunch of our churches are gonna close. They can't sustain themselves, and that's already happening. It's kind of a trickle now, but it'll pick up steam. What's happening in the church writ large is what some people call a consolidation. It's just like in business, larger, stronger, better resourced businesses swallow up smaller, stressed businesses. And so what's happening in churches is that the smaller churches are closing and the larger churches are doing okay. They're doing okay. You know, and as part of, we survived and even thrived during COVID because we were a well-resourced church with really bright people and a good staff. And the way some of my pastor colleagues struggled with how to do online worship and with no help, with no professionals in their congregation. You know, we immediately turned to Carol Ann and Matt, who were at the top of their game, and we did it in a week. And some folks weren't able to even do it in 2 years. And so churches like First Pres will need to change the way we do church. But I don't see the demise of this congregation coming down the pike. Unless we refuse to change. Unless we refuse to change to be, but the church is consolidating. And the statistics show that, you know, we kept hearing about the growth of this category called the nuns, the ones who check no religious affiliation or, you know, that kind of thing, that may have bottomed out. That we may have hit the bottom there and that more people may start coming back. And you look at our Wednesday night supper the last few weeks, crawling with little kids and young families, that some of them came to us during COVID. So I'm very hopeful about this congregation. I'm very hopeful.
One last thing. One of your daughters, I'm sorry, one of your daughters said, I didn't realize it was a university church, but you had a contemporary service that seated over like 1,500, is that?
No, gosh, no.
She hadn't done wrong, but I thought, I wasn't thinking that big.
No. It was by far the smaller of the two services.
Okay.
What, this is called Collegiate Presbyterian Church in Ames, Iowa State University is there. And so the name says it was a church that was connected to the campus and had always sort of like, this church has always had a real mission for the city of Hickory. That church had a mission for the campus. And so they had a separate person who was hired to be the campus minister. And they made the hard decision before I got there, and boy, it was still painful. They made the hard decision because they knew college students were not going to get up and come to church at 9 o'clock in the morning. They made the decision to make their traditional service at 9 so that the students could have the 11:15 slot. Not everybody liked that.
Did it work?
It did, but not without great grief and pain. Just.
I mean, we don't like to get up either.
Yeah, but they had done that.
Well, a lot of churches have combined the two, like when we go up in the mountains, we visit a old Baptist church that they've just taken their traditional service and they put a screen up and a small little praise band. I mean, he's a Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
They just all accepted and they just went through a $500,000 fund that they doubled the size of their sanctuary.
Good for them.
I mean, they have a fish fries where there's probably 300 people, 400 people. You know, it's amazing to see the small churches up there that just keep
Yeah.
keep going.
Any other questions?
When can we get, a Protestant on the Supreme Court? That's what he's running for.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you start your run,
For Congress?
2024, you're gonna have 10 years off,
Oh, goodness.
would you?
Too many, gotta make too many compromises to do that. Sure do, sure do. But I'm very hopeful that it won't be a long, long time before you get your new pastor. Only God knows that, but I'm hopeful it's sooner rather than later. And, but I know you'll be in good hands, until that time. And I have utmost trust in the pastoral nominating committee. And,
Thank you for that, just doing that decision to, yeah, I really do.
it just makes sense. It just makes sense.
He's got terribly big shoes.
Well, I will be around to help that person, if that person, which I hope he or she will be. And I will be available, and just like I leaned on Wallace, I hope that person will take advantage of that.
Has the Western Presbyterian relaxed
Yeah.
the take they have since they're not in after they, I've heard, I don't know, Mel could probably tell me right off, but that the former pastor can be included in the church hereafter or so.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, I will stay away for a year. Unless, unless,
Don't make us.
I'm looking at Amelia, I mean, you got the sesquicentennial coming up, and so if there happens to be a little party around that, then maybe I'll get an invitation.
Don't make us come to the island and get you.
But I will stay on, and, but if we run into each other at Lowe's Foods or Lowe's Hardware or at some bar, we can talk as friends, we just won't talk church. Just won't talk church.
We're Presbyterians, we can acknowledge meeting you.
Oh, hello, John. I played golf with Bill Marvin and Bill Pitts and Matt Pitts yesterday in a thing that was raising money for the Hickory High athletic booster fund. And about halfway through the round, Matthew Pitts looked at my golf bag, and it's a Bud Light golf bag. And Matt said, "Oh my gosh, I just noticed that." He said, "Surely you won that in a charity event. Surely you didn't buy that."
I got to brag on Whit now. My husband came home bragging on Whit because he was playing with him, and he said, "I think Whit won the big prize." But what Whit did, you're not gonna believe this now, right? They had was their par three.
Par three.
And he hit his ball with one shot, right? Closest to the hole. And you were how many feet from the hole with one shot?
Well, it was it wasn't all that close. It was 15 feet, but
that's
it was a
pretty
hard hole.
With one, Bill said it was a very hard hole. With one shot now, he won the prize. You got $100 prize.
I got a $100 gift certificate to Boston.
To Boston, which is a fantastic restaurant. People have to have it there. It's a great restaurant.
So it's,
Maybe a mini needle.
so the Bud Light bag isn't gonna, it does me well.
You know the difference in a Baptist and a Presbyterian?
About when they see each other in the liquor store?
Presbyterians speak to each other.
Well, thank you, folks, for your attention, and thank you for all you have been and meant in my life. This is not goodbye, obviously, be around a little bit longer. And I'm gonna do something similar to this on Sunday, so if you wanna swoop in. Just kidding, just kidding. But I want to do this for the whole congregation, because it's been a good exercise for me. I mean, Amelia's been on me for months now to write just a little thing about my time here for the history book and stuff like that, and,
With dates.
with dates. That's gonna be tough, that's gonna be tough, anyway.
I think a range of dates.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's gonna be on.
It was about this time.
Yeah, well, make it up, nobody will know.
Okay, thank you all, have a good afternoon.